Look at this. A patrol moves out of the perimeter, walks 200 meters into the jungle, and stops. They don't take contact. They don't get ambushed. They just stop. The radio crackles. A voice calls in a position that doesn't match where anyone is standing. Then the squad waits. Then they walk back. Back home, people called this cowardice. Some called it rebellion. Some blamed the anti-war movement bleeding into the field. But the US Army had its own word for what was happening across dozens of units, in multiple years, documented in official records. They called it combat refusal. And if the Army was writing it down, the real question is what broke down first. Most people assume combat refusal in Vietnam was a fringe behavior. A few politically radicalized soldiers making noise. Maybe men who shouldn't have been there in the first place. The assumption is that the military machine was working fine, and a small number of bad actors disrupted it. That explanation is comfortable. It puts the failure on individuals. It keeps the institution clean. But the documented record doesn't support it. Combat refusal wasn't rare, and the men involved weren't uniformly inexperienced, politically motivated, or afraid of fighting. Many had already done exactly what they were asked to do, walked into contact, taken casualties, moved through terrain that had no name on any map that mattered. They had already proven they would go. The refusals that made it into records weren't from men who couldn't handle combat. They were from men who had looked at a specific order and calculated that the risk had stopped making sense. That's a different problem. And understanding why requires going back to the structure the Army built for this war. The individual rotation system, known as DEROS, date of estimated return from overseas, sent soldiers to Vietnam for 1 year and then brought them home. Each man had his own date. Units were constantly cycling, with veterans leaving and replacements arriving on different schedules. A squad might have a sergeant with 11 months of experience, standing next to a private who had been in country for 6 days. When the sergeant rotated out, the institutional memory of that squad walked onto a plane with him. This was not how the Army had fought before. In earlier wars, units rotated together. Men built cohesion over years of shared training and combat. They knew each other's habits, limits, and tells. In Vietnam, the unit was a revolving door. The bonds that made men follow each other into bad ground. The specific trust that says, "I will go because he would go for me," had to be rebuilt constantly, and it kept getting interrupted. The other pressure was the metric. Body count was the primary measure of progress. Ground taken didn't matter much, because ground taken was often handed back. Hills were fought over, cleared, and abandoned. The same tree lines appeared in after-action reports from different units in different years. Soldiers could see the pattern. A short-timer with 10 months in country had watched enough of the war to understand that the scoreboard wasn't connected to anything that looked like winning. The calendar on the wall, the days left until rotation, started to compete with the order of the day. When those two pressures combined, the erosion of unit cohesion and the visible futility of the metric, the logic that made obedience rational, started to crack. The Army's first response was discipline. Courts-martial for insubordination. Reassignment. In some cases, reduction in rank. The legal tools existed. The problem was using them required admitting what had happened. A commander who reported a combat refusal was also reporting that his unit had broken down, that his leadership had failed, and that a mission had not been completed. That report traveled up the chain. In a war measured by body count and mission success rates, a documented refusal was a liability, not just for the soldier, but for the officer above him. So many incidents didn't become records. Commanders found other language. Missions were written up as completed. Patrols that never reached their objective were logged as having made contact and withdrawn. The discipline system existed, but the incentive structure around it worked against using it honestly. The machine kept producing paperwork that said everything was functioning. Underneath the paperwork, something else was happening. The most visible sign was fragging. The name came from the fragmentation grenade, the weapon of choice when a soldier, or a group of soldiers, decided that an officer or NCO had become a threat to their survival. Pentagon records documented hundreds of fragging incidents across the peak years of 1969 to 1971. Some were threats. Some were actual attacks. Some resulted in deaths. The official numbers are almost certainly undercounts, because fragging required witnesses to talk, and witnesses had reasons not to. Fragging was not random. That's what makes it harder to dismiss. It followed a logic, however brutal and criminal that logic was. The men who became targets were frequently those known for pushing patrols into known kill zones, for inflating body counts by ordering contact with positions that couldn't be won, for treating the metric as more important than the lives attached to it. That doesn't make fragging justified, but it makes it legible. It was a violent, illegal response to a specific failure of institutional trust. The failure that said an officer's career ambition had become more dangerous to a soldier than the enemy. When refusal and fragging became visible enough, a quieter adaptation spread through the units. It went by different names, but the most direct was search and avoid. A patrol would move out from the perimeter, maintain radio contact, call in position reports, and simply not go where the order said. 200 meters into the jungle, the squad stopped. The radio man called in coordinates that placed them somewhere else. The squad waited out the patrol window. Then they walked back. This was not one man making a private decision. It required the entire squad. The radio man had to call the false position. The squad leader had to agree. The platoon lieutenant had to either participate or look away. Search and avoid was a collective act. It demanded the same unit cohesion that combat required, just directed inward, against the command structure, instead of outward toward the enemy. In a war that was destroying cohesion through its rotation policy, some units found cohesion in exactly this. The Army couldn't see it from above. The reports looked correct. The missions showed movement. The radio traffic was there. What command was missing was that the machine had learned to generate the appearance of function without the function itself. But search and avoid didn't exist in a vacuum. It existed alongside something that doesn't get talked about enough: the collapse of the junior officer corps. By the late 1960s, the Army was producing second lieutenants on compressed timelines to meet the demand. Officer candidate school had been accelerated. Some platoon leaders arrived in Vietnam with less than a year of military experience, leading men who had been there for 10 months. The experience gap inside a single platoon, between a new lieutenant and his most senior NCOs, could be enormous. And in Vietnam, that gap was dangerous. A veteran NCO knew which orders were survivable. A new lieutenant who didn't know the ground, didn't know his men, and was under pressure to show initiative and produce results. That lieutenant could get people killed chasing a metric. And the men knew it. The informal authority structure inside a squad often ran through the senior sergeant, not the officer. When a lieutenant gave an order that the sergeant calculated as suicidal, the question of who actually held the squad's loyalty became very clear very fast. This wasn't unique to Vietnam. Junior officers have always had to earn the trust of experienced enlisted men. What made Vietnam different was the speed of everything. The rotation calendar, the replacement pipeline, the pressure to produce results before a man had time to learn the ground, combined with the absence of any visible strategic objective that could explain why the result was worth the cost. In previous wars, men fought for ground that stayed taken, for cities that fell and didn't rise again, for a front line that moved in one direction. In Vietnam, the front line was everywhere and nowhere, and the scoreboard only counted bodies. When the end of a man's tour was visible on a calendar, and the mission he was being ordered into looked like it existed to add to a number rather than accomplish anything permanent, the calculus shifted. Not for every soldier, not even for most, but for enough that the pattern showed up in records, in journalism, in the testimonies that came out in the years after the war. There were also the cases that didn't fit neatly into any category. Men who slowed a patrol without fully stopping it. Platoons that reported contact and broke off faster than the situation required. Small decisions, multiplied across thousands of patrols, that collectively reduced the operational output of units in ways that were nearly impossible to track or prosecute. The Army was not just dealing with open defiance. It was dealing with friction that had become systemic, a low-grade institutional resistance that spread through the body of the force like a slow bleed. Congressional investigations in the early 1970s began pulling at these threads. Journalists had been reporting from the field for years. The internal Army studies, some of which took decades to become public, painted a picture of a force under serious internal stress. The word used in some of those documents was disintegration. Not of individual soldiers, but of the organizational structures that made collective military action possible. After Vietnam, the Army did something unusual for a large institution. It studied itself honestly. The internal assessments that came out of the post-Vietnam era are, in some respects, more candid than anything produced during the war. They acknowledge the rotation system as a structural mistake. They acknowledge that body count as a metric had corrupted the reporting chain from the squad level upward. They acknowledge that the junior officer pipeline had been overstressed, and that the experience gap inside units had created command vacuums that couldn't be filled by rank alone. The reforms that followed were systematic. The all-volunteer force replaced the draft, which changed the demographic and motivational profile of the enlisted force. Unit cohesion became a formal doctrinal priority rather than an assumed byproduct of training. The cohort program, Cohesion, Operational Readiness, and Training, was designed specifically to keep soldiers together longer, to rebuild the bonds that Vietnam's rotation system had dissolved. Officer development programs were restructured to slow the pipeline and increase field experience before command responsibility. The metrics used to evaluate performance were redesigned to make inflated reporting harder to sustain. None of this happened cleanly or immediately. Institutional change in a military organization moves slowly, and some of the lessons took years to fully absorb. But the direction was clear. The Army that emerged from Vietnam spent the late 1970s and 1980s rebuilding itself around the understanding that institutional trust is not a soft concept. It is a load-bearing structure. Damage it, and the operational machine begins producing the appearance of function rather than the function itself. The paperwork looks right. The radio traffic is there. The patrols go out, and then you look closely and realize nothing is actually moving. Go back to the patrol that sat down, 200 meters out, radio in hand, calling in a position they weren't standing in. It's easy to look at that image and see cowardice or rebellion, or the anti-war movement wearing a uniform. The comfortable explanation puts the failure on the men and leaves the institution intact. But the refusal was downstream of something the institution had already broken, a rotation policy that dissolved the bonds that made units function, a metric that rewarded the appearance of results over the reality of them, a command structure whose incentive system made honesty more dangerous than silence, a strategic framework that couldn't explain to the man with the rifle what winning looked like or when it would come. The soldiers who sat down didn't invent the failure, they inherited it. And when an institution loses the logic that makes obedience rational, not obedience to authority in the abstract, but obedience to a specific order on a specific day, in a specific piece of ground, what comes out the other end looks like a breakdown of discipline. What it actually is a diagnostic. The Army spent the next 2 decades writing that diagnostic into doctrine, into training, into the structural design of how it builds and maintains units. Because the lesson Vietnam taught, the hard version, the one that cost the most, is that you can break a military force from the inside without the enemy doing anything at all. If this video made you see that differently, if the patrol that stopped now looks less like a failure of the men and more like the last readable output of a broken system, subscribe. Every week, this channel goes after the military details that look simple on the surface and turn out to be something much bigger underneath. The stories that didn't make the documentaries. The decisions that shaped armies and never got explained. Hit subscribe, and you won't miss the next one.